La Llorona, the weeping woman of the Orinoco. One night in March 1983, a fisherman named Tomas Gutierrez was checking his nets along the banks of the Orinoco River near Ciudad Bolivar when he heard a woman crying. The sound carried across the water, mournful and desperate, the kind of weeping that comes from a soul utterly broken. Tomas had fished these waters for 30 years and knew every sound the river made. The calls of night birds, the splash of caimans, the rustle of capybaras in the reeds. This was different. This was human grief, raw and terrible. He called out, asking if someone needed help. The crying stopped instantly. Then he heard it again, closer now, coming from just beyond the next bend in the river. Against his better judgment, against everything his grandmother had taught him as a child, Tomas moved toward the sound. He found her standing in the shallows, her back to him, wearing a long white dress that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Her hair hung wet and dark down her back. She was looking down into the water, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Tomas asked again if she needed help. She turned to face him and he saw that her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that wept water instead of tears. Her mouth opened impossibly wide, and the cry that came out was no longer human but something ancient and anguished that seemed to come from the river itself. Tomas ran, abandoning his nets, his boat, everything. He didn't stop running until he reached his home 3 kilometers away. He never fished that stretch of the river again. He had encountered La Llorona, the weeping woman, and he understood that he had been warned. Today, I am going to tell you the story of Venezuela's most tragic spirit, a woman whose grief echoes across the waters of the nation. The Venezuelan version of La Llorona centers on a woman named Isabel, who lived in the late 1700s in a small settlement along the Orinoco River in what is now Bolivar State. The settlement was a humble collection of houses built on stilts to survive the seasonal flooding, home to mestizo families who made their living from fishing, agriculture, and trading with river travelers. Isabel was born into poverty but possessed such striking beauty that people said she looked like she belonged in the courts of Spain rather than a river village. She had pale skin unusual for the region, dark eyes and long black hair that reached her waist. By the time she was 16, men from neighboring settlements traveled days just to see her. Her mother, a pragmatic woman named Rosa, understood that Isabel's beauty was their family's only valuable asset and guarded her daughter carefully, hoping to arrange a marriage that would lift them from poverty. When Isabel was 18, a Spanish merchant named Don Fernando arrived in the settlement. He was in his early 30s, wealthy, educated, and handsome. He had come to establish a trading post for goods moving between the interior and the coast. The moment he saw Isabel, he became obsessed with possessing her. Don Fernando courted her with gifts her family had never imagined: fine fabrics, jewelry, imported foods. He spoke to her of life in the cities, of culture and sophistication far beyond the river settlements. Isabel fell deeply in love. Don Fernando promised her marriage, promised to take her away from the poverty and hardship of river life. He promised her everything she had dreamed of. After a courtship of 3 months, he moved her into his newly built house at the edge of the settlement, a real house with walls and a tile roof, the finest dwelling for 100 kilometers. Isabel's mother objected to her daughter living with a man without marriage, but Don Fernando assured her the wedding would happen soon, once he secured proper documentation from the colonial authorities. Isabel lived as Don Fernando's wife in everything but name. She bore him a son, Mateo, and 2 years later, a daughter, Carlota. Don Fernando seemed content with this arrangement, doting on the children and treating Isabel with affection. The settlement began to accept Isabel as Don Fernando's common-law wife, though some of the older women whispered that a man of his class would never truly marry a poor mestiza girl, no matter how beautiful. For 5 years, Isabel lived in a state of suspended happiness. She had escaped poverty, her children were healthy, and Don Fernando treated her well. She told herself that the official marriage would come eventually, that the colonial bureaucracy simply moved slowly. She ignored the warning signs, the way Don Fernando never spoke of her when conducting business with Spanish merchants, the fact that he traveled frequently to the coast without inviting her, the letters that arrived addressed to him alone. In 1795, when Isabel was 26 years old and her children were 5 and 3, a ship arrived carrying officials from the colonial government and a Spanish woman of noble birth named Doña Cristina. The entire settlement turned out to witness this rare visit from high society. Isabel stayed home with the children, as Don Fernando had asked her to do. He said his business with the officials was tedious and she would be bored. But Isabel's younger brother Diego, who worked at the trading post, came running to her house that afternoon with news that shattered her world. Don Fernando was being married that evening to Doña Cristina in a ceremony performed by a priest who had traveled with the officials. The marriage had been arranged by their families in Spain years before. Doña Cristina had finally made the journey to join her betrothed husband. Isabel refused to believe it. There had been some mistake. Don Fernando loved her. They had children together. She dressed herself and her children in their finest clothes, gifts from Don Fernando, and walked to the main settlement where the ceremony was being held. She arrived just as Don Fernando and Doña Cristina were exchanging vows. Isabel pushed through the crowd, her children at her sides. She called out to Don Fernando, demanding he explain this betrayal. The ceremony stopped. Every eye turned to her. Don Fernando's face went through several emotions: shock, anger, fear, before settling on cold dismissal. He looked at her as if she were a stranger who had interrupted an important event. In front of everyone, in front of the Spanish officials and his new bride, in front of Isabel's neighbors who had known her since birth, Don Fernando denied her. "I don't know this woman," he said clearly. "She's clearly unwell. Someone remove her from here." Isabel felt the world tilt. She looked at the crowd, searching for support, for someone to speak up and confirm that she had lived as this man's wife, that these were his children. But the faces she saw showed only pity and embarrassment. The Spanish officials looked at her with disgust. Doña Cristina looked at her with cold superiority. Even her neighbors looked away, unwilling to challenge a powerful man in front of colonial authorities. 2 men took her by the arms and escorted her away while her children cried and clung to her dress. She heard the ceremony resume behind her. Don Fernando married his Spanish bride that night. Isabel and her children walked back to the house they had shared with him. The house she now understood had never been hers at all. The next morning, Don Fernando's servants came and physically removed Isabel and her children. Their belongings, the fine clothes, the small pieces of jewelry, were taken back. They were given only the simple clothes they had worn before Don Fernando entered their lives. Isabel's mother took them in, but the tiny house was barely adequate for her parents alone, much less 3 additional people. The family that had begun to taste prosperity was plunged back into worse poverty than before. The rejection destroyed something fundamental in Isabel. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. She would sit for hours staring at nothing, tears running down her face silently. Her children, confused and frightened by the sudden change in their circumstances, cried constantly. Little Matteo kept asking when they would go home, when they would see his father, Carlotta. Too young to fully understand, sensed her mother's anguish and became clingy and inconsolable. Isabel's mind began to fracture under the weight of shame and despair. She could hear the settlement gossiping about her. The foolish girl who thought a Spanish gentleman would truly marry her. The woman who had given herself and her children to a man without securing her position. She saw the pity in people's eyes, which hurt worse than outright scorn. Worse still, she could see Don Fernando's house from her mother's home, could watch him living his legitimate life with his legitimate wife, erasing her and their children as if they had never existed. One night, 3 weeks after the wedding, Isabel's mother woke to find Isabel gone along with the children. Rosa searched the house and the immediate area, growing increasingly panicked. Then she heard it, Isabel's voice singing a lullaby coming from the direction of the river. Rosa ran toward the sound, calling Isabel's name. She reached the riverbank just as dawn was breaking and saw Isabel standing waist deep in the water, holding Carlota in her arms. Matteo stood on the bank, crying, wet clothes clinging to his small body. Rosa screamed for help and waded into the water toward her daughter. Isabel turned to look at her mother, and Rosa later said that her daughter's eyes were empty, that she looked through Rosa as if she wasn't there. "He threw us away," Isabel said calmly. "We're nothing to him. The children are nothing. Better they return to the water, to God, than live as nothing." Rosa reached for Carlotta, but Isabel stepped deeper into the current. The Orinoco's waters are powerful, filled with hidden currents and dangerous depths. Rosa, not a strong swimmer, couldn't follow without drowning herself. She begged Isabel to come back to shore, to give her the child. Instead, Isabel bent down, submerging herself and Carlotta beneath the surface. Rosa screamed. Men from the settlement, alerted by the commotion, ran to the riverbank. 2 dove in, swimming toward where Isabel had gone under. But the river had taken them. When the men surfaced, gasping, they had nothing. Isabel's body was found 3 days later, tangled in roots 5 kilometers downriver. They never found Carlotta. Little Matteo, traumatized beyond words, told them that his mother had tried to take him into the water first, but he had fought and escaped her grip, running back to shore. He said his mother had been crying and apologizing, saying she was saving them, that this was the only way they could be together away from the cruelty of the world. Isabel was buried in the settlement's small cemetery, in unconsecrated ground, because the church considered her suicide and the murder of her child to be mortal sins. No priest would say words over her grave. The settlement tried to forget the tragedy, to move forward. Don Fernando and his wife moved to Ciudad Bolivar shortly after, his trading post left to others to manage. But 3 nights after Isabel's burial, a fisherman working late heard a woman crying along the riverbank, where Isabel had drowned Carlotta and herself. He investigated and saw a figure in white standing in the shallows, bent over as if searching for something in the water. When he called out, the figure turned toward him, and he saw Isabel's face, pale, wet, her eyes hollow and weeping. She cried out, "Mis hijos! ¿Dónde están mis hijos? My children! Where are my children?" The fisherman ran, and the entire settlement heard his story by morning. The sightings multiplied rapidly. People reported hearing her cries up and down the river, always at night, always near the water. She was seen walking along the banks, wringing her hands, her white burial dress dripping river water. Those who saw her face said her eyes wept constantly, tears mixing with the river water. She would cry out for her children, searching for them endlessly, her voice carrying across the water with supernatural clarity. The pattern emerged quickly. Hearing La Llorona's cries was an omen. Within days of someone reporting her weeping, misfortune would strike. A death in the family, an accident, an illness. Parents began using her story to warn children away from the river after dark. Stay away from the water at night, or La Llorona will take you, thinking you're one of her lost children. Over the following decades, La Llorona sightings spread throughout Venezuela's river systems. The Orinoco, the Apure, the Caroni, smaller tributaries and streams. Each region developed its own variations of the story, but certain elements remained consistent. The woman in white, the crying for lost children, the connection to water, the omen of death or misfortune. In 1891, a priest named Father Miguel documented multiple accounts of La Llorona encounters in Guyana. He wrote of a young couple who heard her cries while walking home after dark. 3 days later, their infant son died of fever. A plantation owner near the Apure River reported seeing her standing at the edge of his property near a stream. The next week, his daughter drowned in that same stream despite being a strong swimmer. The testimonies followed patterns. La Llorona appeared most often during the rainy season when rivers swelled and currents grew dangerous. Her cries intensified during full moons. She was attracted to households with children, especially boys near the age Mateo would have been. Some witnesses reported that she would call out specific names, though never the names of her actual children, as if in her confused, tormented state. She no longer remembered what she was searching for, only that she had lost something precious. In 1957, a mother in Puerto Ayacucho reported waking to find La Llorona standing at the foot of her son's bed, reaching for the sleeping child. The woman screamed and the apparition vanished, but her son developed a fever that night and nearly died. In 1968, a group of teenagers camping near the Caroni River recorded what they claimed were La Llorona's cries on a portable tape recorder. The recording, which circulated among paranormal enthusiasts for years, captured a woman's voice crying, "Mis hijos," repeatedly, growing closer, then suddenly cutting off. The teenagers abandoned their campsite and never returned. La Llorona remains one of Venezuela's most reported supernatural entities. Unlike some ghost stories that fade with modernization, she has adapted to contemporary settings. She's been sighted near urban waterways in Caracas, along the shores of Lake Maracaibo, even near swimming pools and fountains in developed areas. Water calls to her, and she answers. The psychological impact of the legend is profound. Generations of Venezuelan children have grown up afraid of rivers and streams after dark, hearing their parents' warnings about the weeping woman who searches for children to replace her own. The story serves as both entertainment and genuine warning. Drowning is a real danger in Venezuela's powerful waterways, and keeping children away from them at night has undoubtedly saved lives. Some folklorists argue that La Llorona represents the oppression and tragedy of mestizo and indigenous women during colonial times. Women who were used and discarded by powerful men with no recourse or protection. Her endless grief speaks to generations of voiceless women whose stories ended in despair. Others see her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and choices made in anger. Isabel's decision to harm her children rather than accept poverty stands as a warning about letting despair overcome reason. But for those who have heard her cries echoing across dark water, who have seen her pale figure searching eternally for what she destroyed, La Llorona is neither metaphor nor lesson. She is real, present, and dangerous. She is the embodiment of grief so profound it cannot be contained by death. Guilt so heavy it creates its own gravity and pulls the living toward tragedy. Today, if you walk along Venezuela's rivers and streams after dark, locals will warn you to hurry home before nightfall. If you hear a woman crying, they'll tell you to go the other way, to never approach, to never answer if she calls out. Because La Llorona is still searching, still weeping, still drawing the unwary toward the water where her sorrow waits, patient and eternal. Her children are lost forever, drowned by her own desperate hands. And so she cries, wandering the riverbanks of Venezuela through centuries, searching for what can never be found, warning others through her eternal anguish that some choices, once made, echo forever through the dark. El Silencio del Diablo, the Devil's Silence. One night in August 1989, the Morales family was sleeping in their small concrete house in the working-class neighborhood of Caria in Caracas, when Maria Morales woke to absolute silence. Not the normal quiet of night. This was different, unnatural. The usual sounds of the city, the distant dogs, the hum of her neighbor's refrigerator through the thin walls, all of it had stopped. The air in her bedroom felt thick, heavy, like trying to breathe underwater. Then she noticed the temperature. Her breath came out in visible clouds despite the summer heat. She tried to call out to her husband sleeping beside her, but her voice wouldn't come. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw it. The crucifix on the wall across from their bed was slowly rotating, turning upside down with no hand touching it. Then every drawer in their dresser slid open simultaneously without a sound. Maria's paralysis broke and she screamed, waking her husband Carlos. The moment he woke, everything stopped. The drawers were closed, the crucifix hung normally. The temperature returned to the stifling heat of a Caracas summer. But Maria knew what had visited their home. Every Venezuelan knows it was El Silencio del Diablo, the devil's silence. And once it finds your home, it rarely leaves. Today I am going to tell you about Venezuela's most insidious supernatural entity, the one that doesn't announce itself with screams or crashes, but with the absence of sound and the presence of dread. Unlike most supernatural beliefs in Venezuela, El Silencio del Diablo has no single origin story, no tragic ghost or wronged spirit at its center. It's older than that, more fundamental. The belief exists across all regions of Venezuela, from the Andes Mountains to the Caribbean coast, from rural villages to modern apartment buildings in Caracas. It transcends class, education, and even religious devotion. Even skeptics, when pressed, will admit to experiencing something they couldn't explain, a night when the silence felt wrong. The phenomenon is described consistently across hundreds of accounts. It always happens at night, usually between midnight and 3 in the morning. It begins with the silence. Not just quiet, but the complete absence of sound, as if someone has placed the entire house inside a vacuum. Dogs stop barking mid-sound. The hum of electrical appliances cuts out. Even the sound of one's own breathing becomes muffled, distant. This silence is always accompanied by a dramatic temperature drop. Witnesses report their breath becoming visible, frost forming on windows, even in tropical heat. What makes El Silencio del Diablo particularly terrifying is what happens within this envelope of silence and cold. Objects move, not thrown or tossed violently, but deliberately, slowly. Doors open and close without creaking. Pictures rotate on walls. Furniture shifts position. Crucifixes turn upside down. These movements happen in peripheral vision, stopping when directly observed, resuming when one looks away. The entity seems to delight in being almost seen, almost caught in the act. Some witnesses report seeing a shadow, not cast by anything, but existing independently, moving against the logic of light. Others report whispers, but whispers that seem to come from inside their own heads, indistinct words in a language they almost recognize but can't quite understand. Many report the sensation of being watched by something with profound malevolence, something that knows them intimately and wishes them harm. In 1976, a family in the city of Maracaibo experienced El Silencio del Diablo for nearly 3 months, one of the most documented cases in Venezuelan paranormal history. The Rivas family, Eduardo, his wife Sofia, and their adult sons Miguel and Rafael, both in their early 20s, moved into a modest house in the La Lago neighborhood. The house was unremarkable, built in the 1950s, previously occupied by an elderly widow who had died of natural causes. Nothing about the house suggested trouble. The first occurrence happened on their 9th night in the house. Miguel was studying late in his room when the silence descended. He noticed it immediately. The traffic noise from the nearby avenue simply stopped. He looked up from his textbook and watched his desk lamp rotate slowly on its base, the shade turning to face him as if the lamp itself were looking at him. His immediate instinct was to call out, but he found his voice wouldn't work. The air had turned frigid. He could see his breath. The lamp completed its rotation and stopped, now facing the opposite direction. The silence lifted as suddenly as it had come, and Miguel heard the traffic noise resume, exactly as if someone had unmuted the world. He told his family the next morning, expecting them to dismiss it as stress or imagination. Instead, his mother went pale. She had experienced something similar 2 nights before, but had convinced herself it was a dream. A religious woman, Sofia, immediately insisted they have a priest bless the house. Father Antonio from their parish came that afternoon. He blessed each room with holy water and prayers, placed crucifixes in every bedroom, and assured them that God's protection would keep them safe. That night, every member of the family experienced El Silencio del Diablo simultaneously. Eduardo woke at 2:17 a.m. to the oppressive silence. His wife was awake beside him, her eyes wide with terror, trying to speak but unable to make sound. They watched as the crucifix Father Antonio had placed above their bed lifted off its nail and floated horizontally in the air for several seconds before dropping to the floor. In Miguel's room, every book on his shelf was being pulled out one by one and stacked in the center of the floor. In Rafael's room, his closet door was opening and closing repeatedly, each time revealing what looked like a darker darkness inside, a shadow with depth and presence. The silence lasted 7 minutes by Eduardo's watch, 7 minutes that felt like hours. When it ended, the family gathered in the living room, shaken and exhausted. This pattern continued for weeks. Some nights nothing happened. Other nights the silence would descend multiple times, each visit lasting longer than the last. The phenomena escalated. Objects didn't just move. They appeared in impossible places. Sofia's rosary, which she kept in her nightstand, appeared hanging from the ceiling fan in the kitchen. Family photographs were found face down or turned toward the wall. Food in their refrigerator would spoil instantly, going from fresh to covered in mold between one moment and the next. The psychological toll was severe. Eduardo, a mechanic, started making mistakes at work, his hands shaking from lack of sleep. Miguel abandoned his university studies. Rafael, the youngest, began to change in disturbing ways. He stopped sleeping, would sit in his room staring at the walls, claimed he could hear the whispers even during the day. He said the silence was teaching him things, showing him truths about the world and about God that no one else could see. By the third month, the family was desperate. They had consulted priests, spiritualists, indigenous shamans, and even a psychiatrist for Rafael, who was clearly deteriorating mentally. Nothing worked. If anything, the attempted interventions seemed to anger whatever was in the house. The night after a spiritualist performed a cleansing ritual, the silence descended and lasted for 3 hours. During that time, every mirror in the house cracked, every plant died, and the family reported seeing a figure standing in the hallway, tall, impossibly thin, made of the same quality of darkness as the shadows they had been seeing, but coherent, formed, present. Finally, they made the decision to abandon the house. They left everything, taking only clothes and documents. Within a week of moving to a new apartment across the city, the phenomena stopped. Rafael slowly recovered, though he never spoke about what he claimed the silence had taught him. The house in La Lago sat empty for 2 years. 3 different families attempted to live there, and all 3 left within weeks, reporting the same phenomena. The house was eventually demolished in 1980, and a commercial building was constructed on the site. Workers during the demolition reported that the basement, which shouldn't have existed according to the house's blueprints, contained symbols carved into the concrete floor, symbols that none of them recognized, but that made them deeply uneasy. These symbols were destroyed with the demolition. In the decades since the Rivas case, researchers and folklorists have attempted to identify patterns in El Silencio del Diablo manifestations. Certain factors appear repeatedly. The phenomenon targets households, not individuals. It rarely follows people who move. It seems drawn to discord. Families experiencing conflict or stress are more vulnerable. It escalates when challenged. Religious interventions often temporarily intensify the activity rather than stopping it. Venezuelan folk wisdom has developed numerous protections and responses. Salt lines across doorways and windowsills are considered essential. Prayers must be said in silence, as speaking them aloud can provoke the entity. Crucifixes should be placed upside down intentionally, the logic being that when the entity inverts them, they'll be right side up. Some believe that maintaining absolute stillness and silence yourself when the phenomenon occurs will cause it to pass more quickly, as the entity feeds on fear and reaction. The Catholic Church in Venezuela has a complicated relationship with El Silencio del Diablo. Officially, the Church acknowledges the existence of demonic entities and offers exorcism and blessing services. However, many priests privately express frustration that El Silencio del Diablo doesn't follow the expected rules of demonic oppression. It doesn't respond predictably to holy water, prayers, or blessed objects. Some theologians have theorized that it may not be a demon in the traditional Christian sense, but something older, something that predates Christianity in Venezuela. El Silencio del Diablo has not diminished with modernization. If anything, reports have increased in the 21st century, particularly in Caracas and other major cities. In 2012, an apartment building in the El Paraíso neighborhood experienced a wave of incidents across multiple units over a 6-month period. Residents reported the familiar silence, the cold, the moving objects. What was unusual was that all affected apartments were on the same vertical line, stacked one above another from the 3rd to the 7th floor. Residents began comparing experiences and discovered disturbing similarities. The silence always began in the same corner of each apartment, the southeast corner regardless of the room. Objects always moved in the same sequence. First crucifixes or religious items, then photographs, then furniture, then appliances. The whispers, when heard, seemed to increase in clarity as the weeks passed, though no one could bring themselves to say what the whispers were revealing. One resident, a journalist named Patricia Salazar, attempted to document the phenomena. She set up a video camera in her apartment pointed at the corner where the silence always began. The camera recorded nothing during the periods when Patricia experienced the phenomena. The timestamp showed the correct duration, but the video was completely black, with no image or sound, as if the camera had been turned off, though it remained running. More unsettling, when Patricia reviewed the footage, she could hear her own breathing on the audio track, increasingly panicked, though she had no memory of those moments. It was as if the camera had recorded her experience while she was somehow not present to experience it herself. The building management eventually hired workers to open up the walls in the affected apartments, looking for some physical cause. Gas leaks, electrical issues, anything explainable. They found nothing unusual. However, construction workers refused to continue after the 3rd day. They reported feeling watched, experiencing sudden vertigo and disorientation, and hearing whispers when they were alone in the walls. One worker quit immediately after he saw his own reflection in a pipe move independently of his body, reaching out toward him while he stood still. The phenomena in El Paraíso gradually diminished and eventually stopped, with no clear reason for either the beginning or the end. Today, El Silencio del Diablo remains a living fear in Venezuela. Online forums dedicated to paranormal experiences in Latin America contain hundreds of accounts, many posted anonymously. The consistency of descriptions is remarkable. The silence, the cold, the slow movement of objects, the sensation of malevolent observation. What makes El Silencio del Diablo particularly insidious is its subtlety. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic violence. It doesn't leave obvious evidence. It operates in the space between sleeping and waking, between sound and silence, between presence and absence. It's the supernatural entity for an age of uncertainty, manifesting not as a clear monster to be fought, but as a presence that undermines reality itself. Skeptics point out that many of the phenomena associated with El Silencio del Diablo can be explained by sleep paralysis, auditory hallucinations, or simple coincidence. The temperature drops could be natural drafts noticed only when one is already frightened. The moving objects could be misremembered or exaggerated. The silence itself might be a perceptual shift caused by stress or fatigue. These explanations satisfy some, but they don't address the shared experiences of multiple witnesses, the physical evidence of moved objects found by entire families, or the profound psychological impact that transcends what mere imagination typically produces. Those who have experienced El Silencio del Diablo often struggle to convey the full nature of what they encountered. It's not simply about silent rooms or moved furniture. It's about the quality of the presence, the certainty that something with intelligence and malevolence has entered your most private space. It's about the understanding that safety is an illusion, that the walls and locks that protect us from the physical world offer no barrier to something that exists in silence and shadow. And perhaps most disturbing is the sense that El Silencio del Diablo is patient, It doesn't hurry. It doesn't rage. It simply waits in the silence between sounds, in the darkness between shadows, for the moment when fear makes us vulnerable. Then it enters, making itself known through the absence of what should be there. Sound, warmth, the comfort of believing we understand the rules of the world we inhabit. In Venezuela, when the night grows too quiet, when the silence feels heavy and wrong, people know to be vigilant. Because El Silencio del Diablo doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives, patient and merciless, to remind us that some things exist beyond explanation, beyond protection, beyond light. And it's waiting still.
We made it out of this one, but the darkness runs deep. If you think you can handle it, check out the other cases on the channel. Don't risk losing the signal. Like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. The next investigation is starting now.